Everybody ready? Ready?
Yeah.
All right, listen.
It's your weekend show.
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
With Bob Biermann.
It's great.
Well, when we left off last week, we were in the middle of sharing a bit of a story from my life from way back when in the 1970s. And as oftentimes happens on your weekend show, we just ran out of time. The clock, well, it doesn't give you any mercy or any leeway. We only have 1 hour, and when that time is up, the program is over. We're going to get back to that topic in just a few minutes, and I'll kind of recap what we talked about last weekend if you were listening to the program and are kind of curious whatever happened. And we'll be doing that in just a few minutes. This is your weekend show. I'm your host, Bob Biermann. So glad that you're taking some time this weekend to share it with me. We've been doing this program now for over 3 years. We are now entering our 4th year of your weekend show, heard each and every weekend on international shortwave and also online and some domestic radio stations as well. And I'm always thankful for the emails that I get from listeners, not just in the United States and Canada, but even from around the world that hear this program. And I really do hope, this is my desire, to present to you a program with things that you can use in your daily life. Over the time we've been doing this program, we have broached a number of topics. We've talked about current events. We've talked about things in technology today and where the world is going. We've talked about how life used to be. And of course, hindsight is always 20/20. Let's be honest. I can look back fondly at the time that I was raised in the late 50s and the 60s and 70s and getting on with my life, going toward adulthood. And I've got a lot of fond memories. It's amazing how the mind can block out some of the bad things. But as I look back and I analyze that time, overall, in spite of some of the things you go through in life, it was a great time to be alive. It was a great time to grow up. Life in the 1960s in particular and right into the 1970s, we had enough technology to make our lives a whole lot more comfortable than it had been 50 or 100 years prior to that time. We had heat and air conditioning, we had automobiles, we had jet airliners, we had television, we had radio. We had a lot of things that made life, well, relatively easy. The economy during the years that I grew up was relatively stable. People didn't worry too much about losing their jobs. And we all had goals in life growing up to get a career, get married, have a family, and do all those things that our parents did, but even go maybe a step beyond, as always has been the goal of people since the beginning of recorded time. My parents were raised as kids during the Great Depression here in the United States, and that depression affected many parts of the world as well. My father, when he turned 17 years of age, gave up his dream of being in a big band, as I told you a couple of weeks ago, and joined the United States Marines and ended up serving in the Pacific Theater. He never talked too much in his life about those years in the Marines till later on, when I was probably getting into my 40s, before my dad ever shared some of the experiences that he had. And I think of the courage and what those young people went through. There were those that served in the European theater. I have met men that stormed the beaches at Normandy on that D-Day in 1944, less than a year before the war in Europe did come to an end. It was a difficult time for those raised in what's called the greatest generation. Like I say, they came through the Great Depression, so many did without a lot of the things even their parents had just before them. And then they are called to go to war, and those that stayed behind had to do without quite often, and even worried if this war was even winnable on two fronts. I've talked to my grandparents in particular, and they shared with me many, many years ago, there were times, especially in the first couple of years of that war, when we were being defeated oftentimes and not having that many victories in the Pacific. And we wondered what could be done in Europe. Would this be a winnable situation? And what would be the future of the United States if we failed in our mission? Yet by 1945, the war on both fronts, the Pacific Theater and Europe, gradually came to an end. And a new era set in, which became ultimately the Cold War period, starting in the late 1940s. And that stayed with us for almost 40 years until the late 1980s. 40 years of wondering at times, and it was a little hotter, a little warmer of a Cold War, especially in the early 1960s. But somehow war never did break out. And I guess that is a good thing. As a child, I had my concerns living close to New York City, but I never dwelled on it all that much. There were just those times because it would make the news. Something would happen, and we would be concerned. I was a very young child in 1962 when the Cuban Missile Crisis came about, and people, especially in places like Washington, D.C., New York City, Miami, whatever the case may be, worried about what those missiles from Cuba could do if we ever went to a war. It was a deep concern, and I remember my neighbors in Long Island, in the big city of Hicksville, Long Island, barricading and setting things up for a fallout shelter in their basement. And I remember my brother David and myself wondering and asking our dad, are we going to build a fallout shelter too? And my dad had thought about it and very pragmatically said, no, we're not. We have a trust in something a little bit higher than that. And he also is maybe a realist, maybe pragmatic, maybe a fatalist. I don't think fatalist is the word that should be used, but what good would it do in the event of a nuclear attack at that point with hydrogen bombs, now the new type of weapon? And we know so much more today about what we had then, and who knows what is in the arsenals around the world today. And if we dwell on our ultimate self-destruction, how do we ever advance as a people? That's one of the things we do talk about from time to time on this program, and the way the world was, the way the world is, and the way the world could and may very well be. And like I say, in a few minutes from now, we're going to get back to that topic that I was beginning to share last weekend. And people, I've learned one thing about this program. When you share some memories and even some of the music of a period of time, a lot of people respond to this kind of a program. I have debated from time to time, do I want to do a program talking about current events, talking about politics, talking about the end of the world, whatever the case may be. There are times I've considered doing it, but for whatever reason, when it comes to this particular program, that is not the emphasis. It is an underlying theme from time to time, but to be honest, I don't want that to be the emphasis of this program. There are a lot of voices out there on the radio, on shortwave, online, that do an outstanding job of discussing and putting current events into perspective, and also to chronicle how we have progressed and regressed as a society. My wife and I were talking the other night and I can't remember the exact date, maybe one of you know off the top of your head, here in the United States when we ended up having to have a rating system for motion pictures. You know, for years, you never worried about the content of a motion picture. We never had to discriminate by age for an audience. We didn't have ratings. But movies began to get deeper into some adult-only themes, and the Movie Association decided we needed to have a rating system so people knew when they walked into a theater and purchased a ticket what they were getting themselves into. And so it started out with movies rated G or PG, parental guidance advised for those under the age of 13. And then you had R, which was restricted to 17 and older, and then X, which was purely pornographic and adult material. You know, I'm thinking about a song that came out talking about whatever happened to Randolph Scott. Remember that song? It was done by the Statler brothers, and it kind of tells us where we were already heading in the 1960s, sowing the seeds that we are more than reaping in this day and age. Once again, this is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. We do have a website. It is called yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. You can send an email. You can even hear some prior programs from the website. And, of course, you can find us on Facebook. Look for Your Weekend Show. And I've learned if you make that one word, Your Weekend Show, it pops right up, number one. And maybe you'll pay a visit to our website or our Facebook page. But getting back to what I was saying, and like I say, I do want to get back to the topic we had last week, and I was sharing how I got in this radio business, and I went back to a time that I was in high school. And it was a different time than it is today. And I had this hobby and this dream about being in radio, and how some of my high school friends and I endeavored to go into the radio business on our own. Yeah. As I mentioned last weekend, I'm assuming that the statute of limitations has run out, because I'll be honest, I was what they call a pirate broadcaster back in late 1970, 71, and into 1972, early part of 72. But it is what launched my career in radio, and I want to share some more about that. But there were other things that were occurring at the same time. And these are the kind of life experiences we all have. You know, that first real love also occurred during that time. It was a time that you grow up, you mature, you begin to understand the realities of life. You begin to look forward to building a life, something I'm afraid too many of our young people don't quite comprehend today. Too many of our young people are living in their device and their virtual world to see the reality of all the things around them. Some overcome that, some excel, but far too many live for the moment and never plan for a future. Back in the 1960s, we started sowing some seeds in our society, whether in Europe, the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States. We began to sow some seeds, and too many of those seeds are now coming to a very bitter harvest in our world today. It all started with the movies. It all started when you had to be concerned of what your children would see if you ever went to the theater. You know, I remember going to several movies as a child, and one that always stands out to me, and I still enjoy seeing it on television occasionally to this day. Remember The Sound of Music? I love that movie. Remember Mary Poppins? You could go to movies and they were family. Even dramatic movies. Maybe the plot would be over the heads of some young children, but the content in that movie, there was nothing to be afraid of in sharing that movie with a young child. And like the Statler brothers sang many years ago, whatever happened to Randolph Scott?
Everybody knows when you go to the show, you can't take the kids along. You've got to read the paper and know the code of G, P, G, and R and X. And you got to know what the movie's about before you even go. Tex Ritter's gone and Disney's dead and the screen is filled with sex. Whatever happened to Randolph Scott riding the trail alone? Whatever happened to Gene and Tex and Roy and Rex the Durango Kid? Oh, whatever happened to Randolph Scott, his horse plain as could be? Whatever happened to Randolph Scott has happened to the best of me. Everybody's trying to make a comment about our doubts and fears. True Grit's the only movie I've really understood in years. You've got to take your analyst along to see if it's fit to see. Whatever happened to Randolph Scott has happened to the industry. Whatever happened to Johnny Mac Brown and Alan Rocky Lane? Whatever happened to Lash LaRue? I'd love to see them again. Whatever happened to Smiley Burnett, Tim Hope, and Gene Autry? Whatever happened to all of these has happened to the best of me. Whatever happened to Randolph Scott has happened to the industry.
Well, whatever happened to Randolph Scott? Statler Brothers here on your weekend show. So glad you're with us on your weekend show this weekend. And once again, a fast reminder about the website, yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. Also, find us on Facebook. Look for Your Weekend Show. I would love to hear from those that hear this program each and every week. As I told you at the beginning of the program, I wanted to pick up on something that we started talking about last weekend. I was sharing a little story about how did I get into this radio business all those many years ago. And it's, kind of an interesting story, the interest you have in life. I don't know what career goals you may have had growing up. Maybe you're younger than I am. Maybe you're older than I am. And somewhere along the way, you had ideas of what you thought you'd want to do as you got older and for a career. I think that I went through several as a child. Oh, of course, I wanted to be an astronaut. Who didn't back in 1963? That was the thing to do when you're 10 years of age, to grow up someday and ride in a rocket ship. I thought about that at one point. But, growing up the way that I did and where that I did as a young child had a lot of influences on my life that are still a part of who I am today. My first memories as a child is living in Long Island, about 35 miles to the east of New York City, starting out in a small town called Manhasset, which is on the north shore of Long Island. And then ultimately we moved to a town called Hicksville because my parents really wanted my brother and I, and eventually my sister, to have the opportunity of being in a parochial or a private Christian school. And there was quite a good one there at the time called Trinity Lutheran in Hicksville. And my parents moved there just for that purpose. And my father at that time was working in construction. He loved that industry. That's what he did his entire life. He really wanted to be a big band leader when he was probably a teen, but World War II changed that. He thought about electronics because he had studied that for a while in the Marines and used that as part of what he did in the Pacific Theater. Long story, I'll share that some other day, of what he did behind enemy lines. And he shared that much later in his life when I was well into my 40s. And it was a fascinating story to hear, and I do want to share that one of these days. My father is no longer with us. I lost him in 2002. But it was good to learn a lot about his life and the goals that he had set for himself following that time in the Second World War. He started out as a cabinet builder, and then as a builder, and then into major industrial construction. And that's how he paid the bills and helped raise the family I was growing up in. But my father got tired of all the commuting and all the traffic that Long Island and New York City and everything has to offer. You know, for 2 years of his life, he traveled almost 2.5 hours one way to work each day and 2.5 hours back from a town upstate New York where they were doing a major construction job. And during that time going upstate, he started realizing, you know, maybe there's a better way to live than being packed, as he would say, like sardines, even in Long Island, which is all that I knew growing up. He thought there'd be a better place, and he found it. And in 1967, we left Long Island for a small community in upstate New York. Now, as a child growing up in Long Island, I listened to all the big radio stations out of New York City. And I was fascinated by radio. I wanted to be in radio so bad. I really thought that would be something I would like to do, though I never thought I had the talent or the voice to do it. I didn't believe I could ever make it in radio, but I still loved it and still dreamed about it. When we arrived in upstate New York, I was happy to learn that my little radio that I had by my bedside, my little AM radio, could pick up all those favorite radio stations at night out of New York City, about 260 miles away. But not only New York City, I was suddenly exposed to radio stations out of Chicago, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Wheeling, West Virginia, you name it. Stations from all over the Detroit, Michigan area. CKLW, Windsor, Ontario, Canada. I listened to them all, and I dreamed that someday maybe I could maybe be one of those nighttime disc jockeys on one of those big radio stations that covered many states and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people each and every night. That was kind of my dream. When I was in high school, I had a few friends. Maybe I was a little bit geeky, for lack of a better term, and we were trying to find a hobby or something we could do, you know, to pass the time. You know, hobbies back then were more creative than today. Today, you just go in front of a device with your thumbs and play a game. Back then, you had to learn something, to do something, to take up a hobby. I think my father wanted me to build model airplanes, and I never did really. I liked it. I just never got into it as much as he did. I learned to love electronics, and I love the idea of radio. And back in those days, radio is a lot different than it is today. Radio today, lots of computers. I know, I'm in the engineering side. I've been dealing with this for almost 40 some odd years of my career, how things have changed in the industry. Radio back in those days was primarily microphones and turntables that played, 45 RPM records and albums and tape decks. And the creativity that we could produce with those items was immense. Radio back then was personality driven. And I wondered if I had the right stuff. And we thought about it, and as I told you last week, if you're listening, we decided maybe we would build a little radio station to entertain our friends in our immediate neighborhood. And we spent a number of months building the equipment from scratch. Yeah, we learned a lot about electronics. We read a lot of books and had a lot of kits to learn how to use the tools of the trade. I had started doing that when I was around 11 or 12, really getting into electronics as a hobby. And so to build this equipment and build this studio took months. It took quite a long time and a lot of effort. My father was so helpful in teaching me the basics of electronics and providing me the resources and materials. And our first little transmitter, for what it's worth, was a little AM transmitter, the type you could buy at an electronics store. They were designed only to reach out on AM maybe a couple 100 feet, which is what the law allowed. And we started with that after our studio got done. But, it only covered a few houses. Didn't cover a whole lot of people. And then one day we were kind of thinking about how could we extend the range. We tried everything we could with this little box. And to build the antenna required would have been just something we couldn't do. And so we kind of began to give up on AM, and I thought about FM. FM was not a very big commodity back in 1970. It was still in its infancy in terms of what it is today compared to AM radio. But I thought, maybe we'll try to add FM to this as well. We could be AM and FM. Why not? And we ran across a little device in a electronics store near Rochester, New York, one Saturday afternoon. We were taken over there to kind of look around for our little studio, and we found this little device, and we bought a couple of them. They were not expensive, and learned a lot about it. And we discovered within a few months the things we could do with FM that I could never do with AM in terms of coverage. The first little FM unit got out about over 2,000 feet, almost a quarter mile. And with some modifications and an outdoor antenna, suddenly it was covering about 2.5 miles. Maybe 3 miles at night if the conditions were right. But this was a small town, and we're covering the majority of this little community on this very little low-powered FM. And all of a sudden, we started getting audience within our high school friends. And it became quite an interesting hobby to actually run a radio station, to have to put the discipline and the time in to do it right. We had a ball, and I really think it's what propelled my career. Like I say, the statute of limitations for running a little pirate FM radio station in a small upstate New York town expired decades ago. But I look at that time in my life very fondly. I really do. Those were some good times with some good friends. And I made new friends even in school that were kind of fascinated about this little project that we had running out of a basement with a little antenna on a rooftop that reached out into our small upstate New York community. I told you also last week, and I want to pick up there too, that's also a change in life. I'm a junior in high school. I'm turning 17 years of age. Besides being involved with our little radio station, I'm also working part-time at a little department store in the community, and I'm active in my church. It was a very, very busy and very full life at that time, and I really look back fondly that I had all these opportunities. And through the church, our little Lutheran church in the village of Newark, New York, this new gal had moved to our community, and I met her at a meeting that was actually held at our house to invite new youth to be a part of the youth group in our church. And I met this very quiet young gal, about a year younger than I am, and she was kind of a self-admitted wallflower. She was kind of shy. And, in many ways, I was shy, too, and I was shy for many years. It's funny, I became a different person when I got on radio than I was in person. But we connected in a very unique way, and it took years later to ever find out why and what the attraction was. But I was attracted to her and her to me, and I'm trying to find the words to describe why and what was different about that kind of relationship that we had in those young years of our life. People would say, you're just kids. What do you know about life? I think we learned a lot during the time that we dated. We used to spend a lot of time walking around that community that we lived in, walked for miles, and we talked a lot and communicated. And that's something that I needed in my life desperately. And I never knew until literally almost 40 years later how important that was in our lives. What she had been going through in her home, you would never have known. And what I was going through and where I was at trying to find who I was in my identity and what I could be in life. She helped propel it. Because, see, sometimes those first loves, those people that come into your life can help give you direction. And they help give you some purpose and give you encouragement to build up your confidence to try things you think you can't do. She kept telling me that I could be a radio announcer at a, regular radio station. And I didn't really believe her at first, but she kept encouraging me never to give up on the dream. You could do it. And during that year of my junior year of high school, heading toward my senior year, I began to get that confidence, and I began to, as she said, you sound better every day you're on the radio, on that little hobby radio station. And you can do it. I remember the kind of songs we used to play, and she was one of my most faithful listeners, of course, and she would be sometimes in the studio helping me select the records that I would play when I was doing my time on that little pirate radio station. Had a great time. And I think of some of the songs she loved and some of the ones that I liked. Quite a variety. There are just hundreds of songs that come to my mind that take me from 1970 to 71 into 1972 that we played in that little radio station. One of her favorite groups, and also mine, something we did share. My music tastes are very different. I love everything from classical to, even the classic rock of that era. I still do kind of like it. Brings back for me many a fond memory. But I think one of her favorite groups, I know for a fact, were the Carpenters. And I shared last week the first song she ever wanted me to play that she dedicated to me, her disc jockey. I shared that last week, the Carpenters. Great song. And there were others that she liked as well. And I'm thinking now of other songs that we played at that time that just come to mind in that little radio station. As I began to develop some skills that I never realized then would be so important, not even a year later in my life, as I played songs just like this.
Hello, darling, it's good to hear you. I'm at the railroad station in St. Paul. How are all the folks? I'd love to see them. But girl, I'd love to see you most of all. Well, I've been staring at the rain, and I've been thinking ever since the train left Montreal. Thought I'd always love this life I'm living, but now I know I love you most of all. Many times before, I know I swore that I'd come home to stay, but it always seemed miss you, baby, most of all. I miss you, baby.
B.J. Thomas here on your weekend show as we're doing some memories, kind of going back in the past. You know, I started last week talking about what got me into the radio business. My love of listening to radio as a child, the big stations out of New York City, and then moving to a small community in upstate New York near Lake Ontario and listening to all the big high-powered AM stations coming in at night from Chicago, Detroit. I can remember WOWO, Fort Wayne, Indiana, WOWO Radio, and so many others. And I tried to learn from what I listened to on the radio at night and take these things I'm hearing and trying to duplicate that in our little hobby radio station that we ran in a friend's basement for about almost 2 years during my high school years. Little did I know that hobby would actually end up bringing me into a career. I told you a few minutes ago that I started dating my first true love, let's call it that for lack of a better term, when I was in high school. I had dated before several people, but this one individual stood out. And we had so much in common in so many ways. Her love of music and my love of music, all types. She was in the high school band and I was in the high school chorus. And I can remember it was 1971 in the spring. Still had the little radio station going, but in the spring of 1971, the chorus and the high school band did a great musical presentation of Vivaldi's Gloria. And back then, I still had a fairly decent voice for singing, not so much anymore. But back then, I did one of the solos, and she was one of the people playing in that orchestra, band, whatever you want to call it. And those are some really, really good memories from my high school years to remember singing in that chorus and the fun that I had and what I learned when I was in high school. I don't think they really teach like they used to back then as they do today. It's different. It's a different world today. It's an online virtual world, and we've talked about this before. It concerns me that we put too much of our life online, too much of our heart and soul online, and we become different people often online than we really should be. It was nice to have the ability to learn a trade in a hobby, a decent education to go along with it, the support of family and friends and a church, and even a girlfriend that really encouraged me to reach out beyond what I thought I could do. I always had, let me put it this way, maybe you did too. I always felt I wasn't as good as other people, that I couldn't accomplish what other people had accomplished. I had thought about even being a church pastor, but I didn't think I would have the ability to preach or to do the things that had to be done. I didn't think I had it in me, but she kept telling me, this girlfriend of mine, that I did. That there's nothing that I couldn't accomplish in life if I didn't simply apply myself and take it one step at a time. There's that old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One spoonful at a time. You take your time, invest the time, and work toward a goal. And I learned that from dating this incredible gal during my high school years. We met in 1970, and we dated all the way through 1971 and into 1972. And during that time, like I say, we were involved in our church youth group, the little radio station that I'm talking about that means so much to me. I'm spending a lot of time talking about the little radio station because it really did, in a very funny and unforeseen way, propel me into really being in the radio business, which I still am doing somewhat to this very day. 47 years or more later? Yeah, from that little experience almost a half a century ago to bring me to what I do today. And I have fond memories of that time, as you can probably tell in my voice. It was the fall of 1971. We had been running this radio station about a year and a half. And I'm thinking maybe it's around November or so of that year. I can't remember exactly. It was probably before maybe the Thanksgiving or the Christmas break. Our high school always had 1 or 2 career days at high school. And, you get to sign up to check out possible career options, maybe some college options. And you did this when you were a junior in high school and again when you were a senior in high school to get an idea of what the world is like out there beyond your graduation date. And one of the options, one of the little things I could attend was put on by the local radio station in our community. It was the AM radio station. It was pretty much the most listened to radio station in that county. And I'll tell you the call letters, WACK, AM 1420. It was a top 40 radio station. And I wondered, would I ever be good enough to work at a radio station like WACK? I mean, I'm on this little itty-bitty flea-powered FM in a guy's basement a couple of hours a day and maybe a few hours when I could find the time on the weekend. And there were several of us that did our little radio shows there, and we really had a great time, as you can probably tell. And I thought about it, and I said, I'm going to sign up for that. And I remember the gal I was dating said, you ought to do that. You might be surprised. It might be something you can do. The program director who also did the morning show on WACK, his name was Gary Van. And his real name was Gary Van Vechten. He is long since passed away. And he gave kind of a little speech about the radio business and what it takes to be a radio announcer today. And I already kind of knew a little bit about it because I had been inside of radio stations and we had literally duplicated that in someone's basement on a smaller scale, of course. But I had an idea, how you play the records, how you cue them up, how you do this and that and the other, how you answer requests. Yeah, we even had a request line in that studio. I can still remember the phone number to this day. I won't give it now because I don't want you to dial it because I have no idea who owns that number today. But back in those days, we had a phone number for our little basement radio station. And I remember attending that little seminar to learn about what it takes to get into radio. Do you really need to get a college degree? And I already knew from building a radio station that the engineering side is very important. And it always has been a struggle, even more so today, to find qualified, able-bodied broadcast engineers. And those, you had to have a special license from the federal government to do that kind of work. I went to that little seminar and listened to what he had to say. I remember him saying, you don't have to have the deep voice anymore. We have equipment now that can make your voice sound a little bit more warm and inviting. And that kind of gave me encouragement because I never thought I had that deep, rich voice like the big radio announcers out of Chicago, New York, or Detroit, or any of the other major cities I could hear on my radio at night. I didn't think that I had that in me. And I didn't know if I could ad-lib as good as they could. Then I find out a lot of their ad-libs are pre-written for them to help them along the way. I learned a lot in that little seminar. And as the class bell is ringing and we're getting ready to go on to the next thing we could do for our career day, Gary Van called my name and said, I need to speak to you for just a moment. And I was a little bit apprehensive because maybe he knew about our little radio station running out of a basement. And, I knew that, it's not exactly the legal thing to do. And he called me aside. And he said, can you come by the radio station one day this week after school? And I said, yeah, I'm sure I could. And he said, I'd like to talk to you about maybe coming to work at the radio station. And he said, I'll be honest, he said, I've actually heard you on your little FM radio station. And he said, I think you have what it takes to be a radio announcer. And I'd like you to come by and we'll talk about it this week. And so the very next day, I went to the radio station after school. I was driving a car by that time. I was 17. And I got out of school. I was so excited, and I drove over there, and I went in, and Gary took me into his office, and then he talked about the radio business. He said, it's a lot of work, a lot of hours, and it's not always the most wealthiest profession. He said, apparently you have an inclination also to being a broadcast engineer as well, and I'd like you to meet the chief engineer of this radio station. His name was Terry Muller. I remember that so well. And he said, I'd like you to spend some time with him if you can this week as well, and learn about the engineering side, not just the on-air side. He said the radio business is that. It's a business. It is both the product of the announcer on the air, what the engineering staff does to create and keep a radio station running, and, of course, a sales staff to sell advertising, because that's how a radio station makes money. And I never really thought about that so much, the business side of radio. But Gary was letting me in on how this thing works, and he said, I've got an opening coming up for a weekend announcer. I just got notice this past week that my weekend guy is leaving in a few weeks, and he said, I think you could do it. And I think I could have you trained enough with what you already have learned in your hobby radio station to be able to sit down and do it for real here for a paycheck. Well, I was floored. And 2 weeks later, I was on the air. I remember the first time, it was on a Friday afternoon, before my first Saturday that I was going to be on the air playing the records. He wanted me to read a newscast. They did a little headline newscast in the afternoon, state headlines and local news. And it's just a 2 or 3 minute read. And I sat down at this little table in the main studio with a microphone and my headphones. And I remember I was trembling. I mean, my heart was fluttering. I had the butterfly thing going because I'm about to be speaking on a radio station covering several counties, not just several blocks. It was quite an experience. And I remember I opened the microphone up and my voice was a little bit shaky, I know. But somehow, within a couple of moments, I felt so at ease behind that microphone. The next morning, I was at the radio station at 5:30 on a Saturday morning, getting ready to do the morning show on a Saturday from 6 until, I think, 10 or 11 in the morning. And Gary Vann had gotten up early to also be there with me for my first day in that studio to help me through the things that I had to do that air shift, to be ready to hit the newscast at 5 minutes before the hour, ABC Contemporary News, and to read the weather and to know which records to play at what time and how many oldies to play within an hour. All these things that they did, I had a little baptism by fire, so to speak, as there I was on the radio as a senior in high school for the very first time. Well, because of that, I had to give up my little time on the hobby radio station. That was part of the agreement. And of course, I really didn't have the time because it didn't take long before that little weekend air shift became an afternoon air shift in early 1972. Because they had another staff member that went on to a bigger radio station. That was one thing about that radio station I remember so well. It seemed to be the the farm league, so to speak, for the bigger radio stations in places like Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, or Binghamton in New York State, or maybe a bigger town in maybe Pennsylvania or Ohio. And it was just a great opportunity to be at a radio station that had started the careers of many well-known announcers in radio at that time. And to be one of the chosen few to actually work at that radio station at that time. It had the jingles. It was top 40. It was the most listened to radio station among high school students that I went to school with. And I wasn't all that popular when I was in high school. I had made more new friends because of the little radio station. But suddenly I'm a radio star among my peers as a senior in high school. And I became a fairly popular individual very quickly because people would tell me, would you play this song this afternoon and dedicate it to so-and-so? Yeah, it was a life-changing experience. But also, a couple of other things happened during that time. And I'll get to that in just a few minutes as I think about some of the first records and songs that I played on that little radio station, WACK, in Newark, New York. Songs just like this one.
Last night, I didn't get to sleep at all. No. I lay awake and watched until the morning light washed away the darkness of the lonely night. Oh, and last night I got to thinking maybe I should call you up and just forget my foolish pride. I heard your number ringing, I went cold inside. And last night I didn't get to sleep at all. I know it's not my fault, I did my best. God knows this heart of mine could use a rest. But more and more I find the dreams I left behind are somehow too real to replace. Oh, last night I didn't get to sleep at all. No. The sleeping pill I took was just a waste of time. I couldn't close my eyes 'cause you were on my mind. And last night I didn't get to sleep. No, I didn't get to sleep at all. But more and more I find the dreams I left behind are somehow too real to replace. Oh, last night I didn't get to sleep at all. No. The sleeping pill I took was just a waste of time. I couldn't close my eyes 'cause you were on my mind. And last night I didn't get to sleep. No, I didn't get to sleep at all. No. Last night I didn't get to sleep at all. No. Last night
The Fifth Dimension on your weekend show, and last night I didn't get to sleep at all. Going back and remembering a time in my life, a very special time. That time that got me into radio so many years ago. Starting with a little flea-powered AM that became a flea-powered FM in a friend's basement in upstate New York, to a real job when I was a senior in high school, no longer having to work part-time in a little department store or whatever the case may be. I'm actually on the radio. It was quite a different time for me, let me tell you. It really changed my capital, so to speak, as a senior in high school. And I think about it now, I really had everything a guy like me could ever wish for, hope for, or even dream about. I mean, here I am. I'm a radio announcer on a top 40 radio station. I'm not even 18 yet. I'm 17. I'm dating the most wonderful person in the world that really believed in me and encouraged me to pursue my dream. And so here we are in that first part of 1972 as winter is giving way to spring in upstate New York. I've got it made. I'm already beginning to make plans of what kind of education I want to pursue come the fall. I decided then that I wanted to learn more about the technical side of the business because I learned working at that radio station, a guy that's both an on-air personality and an engineer is a very valuable asset and could make more money. And so I thought about going to an electronics school. I'm beginning to explore the idea of maybe a nearby community college where I could do that and continue working at the radio station. But I had something else in the back of my mind at the time. And we're talking maybe around March of 1972. I'm thinking in about a year from now, this gal that I'm dating, I've been dating now for quite a while, would make an excellent wife. Someone that enjoyed the same things that I did and encouraged me to pursue my dream. And everything was perfectly on track. I had it. I had it made. I had a car. I had a job. I had an idea of where to go to school, and I was piecing it all together. And then something changed on a dime. Life can do things to you. You get these little curveballs, and you have to kind of pick up the pieces. My girlfriend told me that her father had accepted a job in a community in Northeast Ohio about 4.5 hours away from our little town in upstate New York, and she was going to have to move. For the first time in my life, I was shell-shocked. I mean, I learned what it means to have a truly broken heart and watching all my dreams being destroyed. What am I going to do? How am I going to marry this gal someday? How am I going to pursue this career without her? What am I going to do? And I'm going to share that part of the story next weekend because guess what? The clock on the wall, as it did many years ago in the radio business, is telling me the show's just about over. But it's a story next week that I do want to share with you because it begins another chapter and another journey in this radio career that I have so much loved over these decades, almost 50 years of being in this business. You know, come 2020, it will be pushing right at 50 years. Hard to believe. If you've enjoyed this weekend show, why not let me know by visiting our website, yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com, yourweekendshow.com. You can send me an email from there as well. And we also can be found on Facebook. Just look for Your Weekend Show. Make that one word, by the way, Your Weekend Show, and you'll get right to it right away. It would mean more to me than you will ever know to hear from you as we share from the heart these memories. Next weekend's program, I know, is going to be a bit on the bittersweet side, as so many things move forward in one direction as things seem to crumble in another. But it's part of that experience we share together in this thing we call life. And so until next week at this same time, this is Bob Biermann wishing God's greatest blessings upon you.
It's Your Weekend Show with Bob Biermann.